Welcome to another installment of the Evan R. Liblit Memorial Scholarship Fund Waste on Wednesdays webinar series. I am Jim Bunchuck, Town of Southold Solid Waste Coordinator. And before we get started, I just want to let the participants know if you want to comment or ask questions, we're going to do that through the video chat button on the lower right hand part of your screen. That way all the questions will appear, they'll stay there, and we'll be able to refer to them, and we won't need to jockey for position to speak. This is the fifth of six webinars in this series, which has been arranged by Professor Larry Swanson of Stony Brook University Waste Management Institute and the Liblit Scholarship Committee, in lieu of the annual Liblit Memorial Scholarship Awards and Breakfast, normally held each November and very widely anticipated for that event each year. Unfortunately, we obviously can't do that now. Not only have the webinars been informative on the key solid waste issues impacting Long Island and its municipalities, but it has kept those of us in the field in both the public and private sectors connected during this challenging time as friends and colleagues as we continue the vital work of planning and managing solid waste services for our communities. We're grateful to Professor Swanson and the committee, our presenters and participants for keeping this effort going in Evan's memory. Today's topic deals with the vexing issue of transporting waste and recyclables on, around, through, and off Long Island. The island's transportation challenge is somewhat unique in that the waste generated by the 3 million people in Nassau and Suffolk counties, which is a population greater than that of 15 states, cannot be fully handled within the region. The island's 4 waste-to-energy plants provide disposal capacity for only approximately 65% of the island's MSW, meaning 35% must be sent off-island to off-island destinations in approximately 50,000 tractor-trailer loads per year, or some 140 per day. Similarly, most of Long Island's recyclables ultimately must leave the island for end-use recycling facilities, and each of those streams leaving the island must first be processed and or consolidated at on-island facilities, meaning they're subject to both major aspects of this issue, that of intra-island transportation, where the origin and destination are both on island, as well as a very different set of issues involved with off-island travel. Adding to the urgency is the pending closure in 2024 of the Brookhaven Landfill, which will divert tens of thousands of additional tons of C&D waste, currently managed mostly on the island, to long-haul destinations off-island, and yet thousands more trucks if alternatives are not found. While transportation is a factor everywhere, few areas of the country have such a large population and large amount of waste with no local home in such a confined and difficult to reach, meaning very costly, geographic location. Presenting on this today with more detail on these issues and their implications, as well as to explain where things may be headed, are 2 distinguished experts on local transportation issues. Jerry Bogatz, Assistant Director for Planning and Program Management for the New York Metropolitan Transportation Council, and Michael White, Vice Chairman of the Long Island Regional Planning Council and Vice President of Special Projects for Winters Brothers. Jerry will start with a discussion on the view of transportation from, as he says, 30,000 feet, in which he will provide an overview of available existing infrastructure for moving waste and the types of considerations that must be addressed for those methods to handle the ever-increasing waste stream. Jerry has been an assistant director responsible for planning and program management for the New York Metropolitan Transportation Council since 1997. NYMTC is a regional council of governments, which is the metropolitan planning organization for New York City, Long Island, and the lower Hudson Valley. NYMTC is responsible for planning for the use of federal transportation funding in its planning area. And prior to his work at the council, Jerry spent 10 years as the director of planning for the Westchester County Department of Transportation. He holds a master's degree in urban planning from NYU and a master's degree in public affairs from Fordham University. And with that, I would hand this over to Jerry and for his presentation on this topic.
Thank you so much, Jim. Good morning, everyone. Happy to be here on behalf of NIMTIC. I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully that won't be too painful. Here we go. And then we're going to get into it. So Michael White, who's an old friend, had asked me to provide an overview of goods movement in the larger region as a way to discuss issues of solid waste movement on Long Island as a context for that. And of course, you wouldn't think of solid waste as a goods, really. It's really a bad, but it is part of the goods movement system in many ways. And so I'm going to do this quick overview as a prelude to Michael's presentation on the solid waste issue. Jim mentioned something about what NIMTIC is, a regional council of governments. Our members include New York City, 5 suburban counties, including Nassau and Suffolk counties, the state and the MTA, and we have several advisory members, including the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. And these organizations are required by federal legislation that makes funding available for transportation improvements in metropolitan regions. So there are over 400 similar organizations across the country in metropolitan regions of various sizes. And we all perform the same function, which is to plan for and make decisions on, working with our member agencies, the use of federal dollars in our regions. So this particular map shows really this shaded area here is an approximation of this 4-state metropolitan region that really is a larger planning region. Obviously focused on New York City. And you can see here in the core is the outline of NIMTIC's counties, 3 lower Hudson Valley counties, the city of New York, and then of course the 2 suburban counties on Long Island. But there are actually 10 regional councils of governments that cover this area, stretching from eastern Pennsylvania through to Hartford, Connecticut. And we have a basically consortium. We have a memorandum of understanding between these organizations, and we work together on larger regional issues, and certainly goods movement is one of those issues. But this is a large, complex region. Some of the statistics I'm going to show you now are related to this entire area. By the way, this organization is called the Metropolitan Area Planning Forum, or MAP Forum. That's what we've named this consortium of councils. And so you'll see that term come up also in some of these statistics. So we have a lot of goods movement happening in our region in all kinds of different directions. As you can see here by these statistics, which are recent, this is from a recently purchased 2018 TransSearch database. Commodity flow data is of course proprietary in many cases, so we have to purchase it. And it is only collected every 5 years or so. This is the latest information that we're providing these summaries on. You can see that 44% of the tonnage of goods are moving into the map forum region, this 4-state region. 20% are moving out of it, and 36% are moving completely within it. And this does not even show, we're trying to get a handle now from the data of the commodities which flow through our region. We are a corridor region for goods moving from, say, the Atlantic states up into New England and vice versa. So very, very complex set of commodity flows and huge amounts of tonnage, of units, and also you can see the value that's represented here, over $1 trillion. When we look at it by mode, we see a huge dependence on trucks, which is not unusual for metropolitan regions, but I think it is unusual in our region given the size of the dependence. If you look at the tonnage side, only 3% of the tonnage is moved by rail. There are reasons for that, which I'll get into shortly. Many of you know what those reasons are. Interestingly, close to 10% is moved by water, but the rest is largely truck movements. And this really puts a great demand on our already congested roadway system. And it's going to basically feed right into the discussion of how to move solid wastes in the mix of the traffic congestion that we have. If you look at the different types of commodities, you'll see right here that waste or scrap metals is up there in terms of outbound movements. It is, in fact, the highest single total outbound movement from the map forum region. And there's also a sizable movement within the region, and some of the scrap materials are actually coming into our region. But for the most part, we're looking at the outbound movement of waste or scrap materials, and that is very significant in our region and amidst all the other commodities which are moving. Some of the key trends to consider when thinking about goods movement and solid waste movement are that it is growing, and it's forecast to continue to grow. Now, again, I must underscore that this is all pre-COVID, and there will be an impact from the current situation on future movements. If anything, they may in fact amplify some of these trends. But we're looking at close to 40% forecasted increase in the tons moving between 2018 and 2045. That's a preliminary forecast at this point. We haven't fully refined that. So whatever pressure is on the roadway system now, we're looking at additional pressure moving forward. And certainly that's related to increases in employment and population, which again are going to be affected by the COVID situation, but are likely to recover. In our forecast, they recover around 2030 and continue the previous growth rate beyond that. So this situation of large amounts of goods being moved on our roadways is going to continue and increase into the future, most likely. We're also looking at other trends that affect the number of trucks, such as e-commerce. It's difficult to forecast e-commerce, but we do know that it is growing as a percentage of total retail. And again, this is pre-COVID. If anything, COVID may increase these forecasts significantly, given the fact that people are relying on e-commerce now, as during lockdowns and during partial lockdowns, to be able to have access to various goods. So on the left, you see that, it's forecasts of up to 15% of total retail by 2022. And on the right, the e-commerce share of U.S. retail moving upwards of towards 40% by the end of that forecast period. So this is creating a decentralization of distribution facilities, and it's also creating a focus on fast and flexible truck movements and other types of movements for delivery, which is increasing the pressure. Related to this is the movement of less than truckload goods. These are relatively small freight movements. And it's, prior to COVID, it was a key growth portion of the industry. It's 10% larger than it was before the Great Recession. What it's creating is situations where, you have smaller shipments moving with greater frequency. You have terminals moving around and increasing in size and also in locations. And these are related to the e-commerce trends, and they're affecting where the truck trips originate and where they're destined. And then related to that is increasing automation and improved warehouse design, which is really reacting to these other trends. And automation, and different design issues with warehousing and with distribution centers is creating a different mix of those centers across the region. Urban locations are becoming more competitive. We're even seeing things like micro warehousing, where vacant space, say within New York City, which is basically simply office space, is being used as a small distribution center to be able to get deliveries out quickly. So this is affecting, again, where the truck trips are originating and where they're destined. Some of the key characteristics of our region that really exacerbate this situation include major freight volumes in our highway corridors. And this certainly is the case on Long Island. Highway corridors are the most significant conveyances of goods and bads in our region. And that's because of the imbalance and the over-reliance on trucks. We're also seeing that there's a multiplicity of truck trip purposes on those roadways because of the fact that some of the movements are through our region, some of them are moving between terminals and warehouses, some of them are being distributed and moving within the region for different plants and distribution centers, and some of them are now urban delivery. All these different mixes of truck trip types are intermixed on our roadway system and adding to both the congestion and the complexity of the situation. And we have some grave limitations on freight rail, as you know, on Long Island, in that given our topography and the freight rail infrastructure, there is no direct linkage in the vicinity of our region to east of Hudson rail facilities. So goods either have to be barged across the harbor or they have to move 120 miles north to Selkirk to cross the river at that location and come back down on the other side. Neither of those situations create a lot of impetus for a healthy freight rail market east of Hudson. Because of that, multimodal facilities are geographically imbalanced, many of them, most of them being in northern New Jersey, which is where the railhead terminals are, and relatively few east of Hudson. And that means that goods that are moving by rail are being offloaded in northern New Jersey and eastern Pennsylvania and moving by truck across the Hudson River to locations like Long Island and to the north in the Hudson Valley, and then northeast into New England. So this is just reflecting the reality of the different infrastructures that are available for goods movement. And finally, we have major port facilities in our region. Port of New York, New Jersey, including 2 facilities in New York City proper, and the rest in northern New Jersey. One of the largest ports on the East Coast, if not in the world. And this is putting even more pressure on this already complex goods movement scenario. So, Michael, I hope that I was able to give you a decent context of what we're looking at as a larger region in terms of goods movement. And I think at this point, either Caitlin takes the screen back from me or I do something else. So,
thank you, Jerry.
Okay.
I will stop your sharing. There we go.
Great. Thank you, Caitlin.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Jerry. Very fascinating discussion. Have a couple of questions I think I'll bring up a little later, but it's really puts in context, you know, what the limitations we're dealing with are in a way that you know, is very important. Our next speaker, of course, is Michael White. He is Vice Chairman of the Long Island Regional Planning Council, as I said, and Vice President of Special Products for Winters Brothers. And he'll go into more detail on the nature of the transportation issue, providing background on the big picture of how MSW and C&D is managed on the island, why it came to be that way, and then key ways on how that framework needs to evolve to provide cost-effective waste management solutions. Mike is an attorney who works with Winters Brothers Waste Systems of Long Island in development of special projects and municipal services. Prior to coming to Winters, Michael worked with the Office of General Counsel at Tunnel Hill Partners and Wheelabrator Technologies, focusing on solid waste rail transfer and rail-served landfills. Michael has practiced as an environmental attorney for 30 years in the areas of solid waste management, water resources, wastewater management, National Environmental Policy Act, SECRA, Superfund, natural resources. He is also an adjunct faculty member at the Stony Brook University School of Marine and Atmospheric Sciences, SoMAS, for a graduate course in environmental management. He is a member of several important regional environmental and resource organizations, including the Long Island Commission on Aquifer Protection, the Long Island Solid Waste Leadership Council, and where I co-chaired a subcommittee on transportation with him. I think that's one reason I was asked to take part here. And the Long Island Regional Planning Council, and is also on the board of the New York Sea Grant and Dean's Council of SoMAS. And he held earlier positions with the MTA and the Suffolk County Water Authority, as well as Long Island Regional Asheville Board. I don't think there's a regional board that Michael hasn't been a part of in some way. He has undergraduate degrees from Stony Brook University in Earth and Space Sciences and Environmental Sciences, and graduate work in Marine Sciences, and a doctoral degree from Truro Law School. And Michael, we're pleased to have you and your expertise, and please join in and well, we welcome your participation here.
Thank you very much, Jim and Jerry. Thank you for that great overview, kind of setting the stage here. So my presentation should be coming up on the screen, the movement of waste around and off Long Island. So Caitlin, next slide. So we're going to talk, it's about talking trash transportation today. Really 4 segments to this. Solid waste management on Long Island, so I can kind of give you a backdrop of what we know is going on, the crisis that we're in, why transportation of waste is a critical concern with respect to addressing that crisis, and some ideas on some steps to take in addressing the crisis. Caitlin, next slide. So probably many of you on Long Island had seen this. It really sets the stage for what we really need to face here on Long Island, the gridlock island. Certainly, this was no surprise to Long Islanders. We've been in that traffic, but again, it creates the article itself creates a focus on the issue and awareness of the struggle we have, particularly with truck transportation. Next slide, Caitlin. So let's talk a little bit about managing solid waste on Long Island. Long Island has significant and unique challenges in managing solid waste. The Long Island Landfill Law, which was adopted in 1983, prohibits the landfilling of municipal solid waste on Long Island. Municipal solid waste generated in Long Island, therefore, is either disposed of at on-island energy from waste facilities or trucked off-island for disposal at landfills either upstate or out of state. So on Long Island, it's also important to recognize that solid waste management is achieved really through a public-private partnership of industry and municipalities. And having been involved with that a number of years, that connectivity and I think mutual respect is important to the way we're going to solve this crisis. Next slide, Caitlin. So municipal solid waste, current state. MSW generated on Long Island is either burned or exported. There are 4 energy from waste facilities on the island: Hempstead, Covanta, Huntington, Smithtown, Covanta, Babylon, Covanta, and Islip, Covanta. So I like to say thank you to Covanta. Each facility primarily manages residential MSW generated within the towns where those facilities are located, with the exception of Hempstead. Covanta also receives the residential MSW from Brookhaven. The Hempstead, Babylon, and Smithtown facilities also handle commercial MSW that's collected in those towns. And the Babylon Covanta facility also handles MSW from Southold. So each energy from waste facility also accepts a limited amount of, let's call it third-party haulers, when the facilities have capacity available, sort of the spot waste market. Next slide, Caitlin. Current infrastructure for off-island. Thousands of tons of waste are shipped off-island each day for disposal at distant facilities, landfills upstate and other states, as I said earlier. The following municipalities actually utilize the off-island options for managing their residential MSW: the town of Oyster Bay, the town of North Hempstead, Riverhead, Southampton, and East Hampton. And commercial MSW that does not get to go into one of the energy from waste facilities is also shipped off of Long Island. And so to sort of reiterate what Jerry was mentioning as well, is the roadway and bridge infrastructure for transportation in and around this area is certainly highly stressed. And this approach of trucking waste also presents ever increasing costs and a heavy carbon footprint. Caitlin, next slide. So there are other wastes that are of concern that need to be managed in addition to MSW: construction and demolition debris, ash from these energy from waste facilities, yard waste, organic waste, storm debris, dredge spoils, medical wastes, electronic wastes, hazardous wastes, and recyclables. So I've talked a little bit already about MSW. I'm going to continue a little bit more with respect to construction and demolition debris, as well as ash from energy from waste facilities. Next slide. So on construction and demolition debris waste. Construction and demolition debris is generated by construction, demolition, and renovation activities on the island, clearly a key to economic development on Long Island in terms of having an outlet for disposing and or recycling these materials. Construction and demolition debris is usually processed to sort and recover recyclable material. And I think we're getting better at that. But at the end of the day, the remainder must be disposed of typically at a landfill. So on-island disposal of construction and demolition debris is limited. We have the Brookhaven Landfill in Yaphank. We have the 110 Sand Company in Melville, and the ISIP landfill is still open, but extremely limited in terms of the volume that it is taking. So effectively, off-island disposal of C&D goes to landfills via trucks, and some goes off the island into distant landfills by rail cars. It turns out the two rail facilities on the island that are shipping out construction and demolition debris are actually presently operating at capacity. Next slide. Let's talk about a little bit about the movement of waste on Long Island. And this just kind of calls out the patterns of what we're really doing with waste. Collection of residential waste from the curb to a transfer station or an incinerator. Collection of commercial waste to transfer stations and incinerators. Collection of other wastes, yard waste, storm debris, and recyclables from the point of generation to transfer or processing operations. Movement of MSW from transportation to incinerators or off island. Movement of construction and demolition debris from transfer stations to landfills on and off Long Island. Movement of processed recyclables to markets, and movement of ash from the incinerators to landfill. The ash from the Covanta plants on Long Island is going to the town of Brookhaven Landfill, except for Babylon, which has its own ashfill. Next slide. So the crisis. The amount of waste generated in Long Island is increasing. Our population is still growing. The per capita waste generation rates are increasing. Thousands of tons of waste are shipped off of Long Island each day for disposal at distant landfills. And as I mentioned earlier, and emphasized by Jerry's presentation, roadway and bridge infrastructure for long-haul truck transport is highly overburdened and aging. And so this approach will be increasingly more expensive and, of course, with a heavy carbon footprint. Next slide. Continuing on the crisis, the Brookhaven landfill will close in 2024. The current volume of the Brookhaven landfill is approximately 720,000 tons per year of C&D waste, approximately 350,000 tons per year of ash from the energy from waste facilities, and approximately 100,000 tons per year of auto fluff from auto shredding operations. And after the Brookhaven landfill closes, there will be only one C&D landfill, the 110 Sand Company, on Long Island, and no facilities for ash, with the exception of Babylon, which again has its own ash monofill. Next slide. More on the crisis. Any additional demand for trucks to transport and dispose of C&D off island will further stress the current infrastructure and disrupt market economics. We see those costs going up, and indeed a struggle with respect to the availability of trucks. Costs are going to increase for all generators of waste, including municipalities, homeowners, commercial establishments, and institutions. So to successfully address the closure of the Brookhaven landfill, these are just some of the suggestions. Long Island needs to promote more recycling, improve the transportation infrastructure for off-island disposal, expand rail transport for C&D, MSW, and if necessary, incinerator ash, and consider watercraft transportation of waste. Dare I say that, giving some of the history we know about, but we are on an island. So it's really worth a consideration of what the possibilities might be at that option as well. Next slide. So some steps to address the crisis: coordinate and plan for the closure of the Brookhaven landfill, consider an ash monofill at the Brookhaven landfill, which I believe the town is moving forward with. Plan for and develop enhanced transportation infrastructure. Work with the Long Island Railroad and New York Atlantic Railway, who's the freight carrier for the Long Island Railroad and MTA, to foster a robust freight transportation system. Some projects that are hopefully going forward, as well as I mentioned two that exist. Winters Brothers Shamrock Rail Project in Yaphank, Gershell Metals and Rail Development in Medford, The coastal distribution facility in Farmingdale is in operation, but as I said, at capacity. The One World recycling transload facility in Lindenhurst is in operation, but also at capacity. Budget for higher costs. Costs will impact all businesses and municipalities. And again, increased recycling efforts. On-island solutions are needed. An added benefit of that would be job creation. So what we really look to do on Long Island is perhaps having some of the secondary processing go on right here on Long Island for our Long Island recyclables. Next slide. Steps to address the crisis continued. So there's been some legislation on this, and this is an ever-increasing focus. And frankly, with the closure of the Brookhaven Landfill, this is going to be a substantial issue to be addressed. So we need to continue to strengthen laws to penalize illegal dumping, aggressively investigate and prosecute those illegal dumpers, provide some grant money for regional solid waste planning on Long Island, create a regulatory framework that supports efforts to manage waste in an environmentally sound and cost-effective manner. And the last point I want to make is expect game changers. So we had Superstorm Sandy, which everybody remembers, but a major storm can and has seriously disrupted plans and assets for solid waste management, and will seriously reduce disposal capacity that is available. I think the first presentation we gave, like 2 or 3 weeks after we had that a major storm. And frankly, if you look around Long Island, there's still many municipal lots, properties that are still stacked with storm debris. So that's another issue that we need to factor in. So that's it for the presentation, Jim, and hopefully look forward to questions.
Okay, Michael, thank you very much. And I'm not seeing questions in the chat room here. I'm not sure, Caitlin, if that's something that I need to, if there's something I need to expand to see that, but I don't see any coming in there.
No, people just take their time to put in those questions.
But I have a couple though that occurred to me while we're doing this, and I guess for either Jerry or Michael, we talk about infrastructure improvements that are needed. Is there anything on the drawing board with regard to any of the major travel options, highway, rail, or water? I mean, is there anything on the, coming down the pike that is being discussed that we might anticipate?
Michael, go ahead.
I could respond to that a little bit with respect to the rail, as I've been following that issue for a number of years now. Very familiar with New York Atlantic's operation and some of the challenges. So there is the main challenge with respect to rail, freight rail on Long Island, and that is we have a very extensive passenger system. So there are limited windows, but what we've seen, to your question, Jim, is expansion and improvements in some of the real rail infrastructure. More track coming, and that also will move passenger trains quicker and hopefully provide some additional windows for moving the rail freight.
Okay, well, I'm sorry, go ahead, Jerry.
Yeah, so in that regard, just to take that a step further, I think there are two key projects in terms of rail freight movements. One is the mainline third track that Michael alluded to, which is going to improve train movements generally in both directions. The other is, and this is something the region has been looking at for quite some time, is the possibility of a cross-harbor rail facility, which is being looked at now in an environmental stage in a phase 2 environmental assessment. That would connect basically the east of the Hudson rail infrastructure with the west of Hudson rail infrastructure, and could potentially lead to increases in rail freight markets east of Hudson, including on Long Island. So, that's a possibility. It's expensive, and it's by no means been agreed to by everyone in the region, but it is moving forward in terms of project planning and assessment, and we'll see what happens over the next several years. That would be an important improvement to rail freight on Long Island.
I would also say, connected to that, Jerry, is what we've seen is a tremendous improvement not only in availability and capacity in the present barge operations. So that's been significant as well.
Thank you, gentlemen. And we do have some questions coming in now, but one more that I wanted to bring up. It was my understanding that there are some political and regulatory impediments to rail going through the city. Is that, not just infrastructure, in other words, having waste transported by train through the boroughs? Is that still an issue that has to be overcome?
It's definitely a community concern, and depends on how the waste is packaged. And there's been a lot of dialogue in New York City about that, and the railroad has generally been responsive to that, New York and Atlantic. There are other steps that can be taken. And it's often an issue of ownership too. Who owns the rights of way? There's been some incursions on the rights of way in New York City over time because rail freight reached low levels over the last several decades. So it is complicated, but the problems are not insurmountable.
Okay.
So I would add to that, Jim, as well. As I mentioned earlier, presently, there's quite a bit of construction and demolition debris moving off the island by rail. I think last year was probably close to 6,000 rail cars. And so, as Jerry pointed out, there are concerns with the community, specifically around the Fresh Pond Yard in Queens. But I do know, having spoken with them and worked with them directly, both the Long Island Railroad and New York and Atlantic work very hard to address any concerns. In fact, New York and Atlantic actually has an environmental monitor that watches over any of the rail cars that go through. And most importantly, they're moved through that yard as quick as they can.
Okay. Actually, one question with regard to the handling of waste by rail. Is the existing infrastructure able to handle a big increase, assuming, all the issues we're talking about now were smoothed out? In other words, how much more could be exported by rail without having to build a lot more infrastructure?
So I could start on that because certainly, again, I've had some discussions and have been involved and are involved right now with a rail project, hopefully going forward. There is capacity. I don't want to throw out the numbers, but there clearly is capacity. New York and Atlantic works very hard to provide that capacity. One of the things that right now is the freight rail only really operates 5 days a week on Long Island. It could operate 7 days a week. And clearly on the weekends, you wouldn't have as much issues with respect to the passenger trains. So I would leave it to New York and Atlantic and the Long Island Railroad to give you those actual numbers, but I am confident that there's significant assets, or rather capacity, available.
And I would agree. The one restraint on that would be the level of passenger service that currently uses those lines. It's very significant. It's a problem not only on Long Island, but throughout the New York City region, because in many cases, the rail facilities are carrying large volumes of passenger service. But there are ways around that. There's ways to manage that. And I would agree with Michael that there's significant capacity without adding anything to the rail network right now.
Very interesting. We have another question here on getting back to trucking. Given that fuel prices are down substantially over the last few years, what is the biggest driver of the increased cost to truck off the island? Is it, tolls or regulations, or, what's the biggest factor there?
I could start on that as well. The biggest factor is, while right now fuel seems to be lower than it was, there are really issues respecting the availability of trucks. Unfortunately, we're not producing a lot of people who want to be truck drivers. So to find truck drivers is not easy. And the other thing that's happening with long haul trucks is that there's an enforcement, and properly so for the respecting public safety, of the amount of time these drivers are behind the wheel and moving. So with enforcement of that, you're taking more time, which means you need more trucks. So it's not just the cost of fuel, it's the cost of those other features, indeed, getting the trucks in the first place.
And I would just add to that, there's a cost to the congestion. That definitely adds an amount. And, most of the trucking on and off Long Island has to go through New York City. There are ways to subvert that through the ferries, but they're not very efficient, and the volumes are relatively low compared to what moves through the city. So not only are you moving through the congestion on Long Island, but you're moving through the congestion on the city arteries too. And if you go back to the map I showed you, I mean, the volumes on those roadways, the limited access and arterial roadways is very, very high in terms of trucks. So that definitely adds to the cost of moving goods.
Question that there's a couple kind of related to this as far as infrastructure, but has the issue or the option of CrossSound bridge connection, is that completely off the table now? That's, Robert Moses talked about that about close to 100 years ago probably, but is that at all a consideration, or is that just the NIMBY thing would prevent that from ever happening?
The Rye Oyster Bay Bridge goes back to the 60s, actually. In the time since, there have been proposals. There was a private proposal for a tunnel in the 90s, I believe. And more recently, the state did look at the possibility of a crossing. From what I understand, they're not moving forward on that at this point in time. The issue is one of local traffic impacts largely, and also the fact that any crossing would be overwhelmed by demand almost from opening day. So it's a difficult, and you talk about multiple political jurisdictions involved too, including not just on Long Island, but also in the Hudson Valley. So, or Connecticut potentially. So it's something that has been looked at intermittently, but at this point, in our current regional transportation plan, and is not in any way identified as a fiscally constrained project over the long term.
I would also like to emphasize something that Jerry mentioned earlier. So right now we have a barging operation that moves freight cars from Brooklyn to New Jersey. There has already been a lot of study and environmental impact analysis going into this idea of potential rail tunnel in that same route. And what we know is that today the technology of building tunnels is much, much more advanced than it was years ago. So to answer that question, I would see it more likely that there would be a focus and a possibility of that rail tunnel versus any bridge.
Very good. We have, I guess, switching over to the other mode that we haven't talked as much about, but barge. What are the most likely ports that could be expanded or built, to handle barge traffic carrying, exporting waste, and maybe what are the biggest, barriers to that?
So I think the first question, to the first part of the question is, where would there be a port that would be available? I know when we did the sustainable strategies for Long Island, we suggested a deep water port. No location was actually identified. In order to really answer that question, we'd probably at least need something like a generic environmental impact statement, which is what we did back when the Regional Asheville Board started to address the ash issue. And then, of course, you have the problem of getting through whatever neighborhoods you need to get through to the waterfront. And you have some industrial waterfront on Long Island, but not a lot. I would say, though, I recall that during Superstorm Sandy, or rather after Superstorm Sandy, a great deal of storm debris from Nassau County did go out by barge out of Oceanside, and it went up the Hudson, was then taken off the barge, put on trucks, and then trucked to a landfill. So that was a very expensive operation because of an emergency, as well as you're handling that waste several times. But I guess the real answer to that question is it's time to consider that.
Right. The
other problem is one more at the other end, as I just described. I take a barge and I take it to a port like Port of Albany, I got to put it back on a truck. There had been in the past, and I don't know where they stand today, actually barge-served landfills. That may be a possibility still.
I would just throw in that, there are always issues of the economics to the haulers. And as you pointed out, Michael, that, that was expensive because of the number of moves involved. You got to, even a roll-on, roll-off service, you still have to take the trucks onto the barge. Then you got to move the barge, which is expensive because you're talking about tugboats and fuel usage. And then at the other end, get all the trucks off the barge. So what we found with waterborne services is that there are niches for them, but the economics don't always work, even with traffic congestion for trucks. Trucks tend to be more flexible and more economic to the actual haulers and shippers themselves.
Another question here too, that this has come up a few times in the past with regards to C&D disposal, getting back to the nuts and bolts sort of, that there's appears to be a significant amount of tonnage coming out of New York City, filling up the Long Island C&D landfills. And if that's the case, are we in a position, or are the municipalities in a position to try to limit that and reserve that capacity for our own, the island's own demolition debris?
Michael, you're the lawyer, so.
I resist giving legal opinions, but let's talk about it as a practical sense. I think over the years there had been waste from the city going out to the Brookhaven landfill, and the question you ask about that limitation is a good question. I don't know if it's ever been answered, but when the Brookhaven landfill closes, and actually in recent years, the majority of waste that goes into the 110 Sand Company landfill is from the city. So there's obviously some economics that makes that work, and it's a private landfill. So from the big picture, I think it'd be hard to say you could limit that landfill from the customers it could choose from.
Okay. Also, with regard to C&D, and this is something I heard, I guess, they're doing in California now, is Michael, you were talking about increased recycling of C&D debris. California, I guess their local codes, they're starting to pass what they call deconstruction as opposed to demolition. So when a building is coming down, it can't just be bulldozed and put into dumpsters to be taken away. It's got to be poured through for reusable materials, whether as is or materials that can be processed more, without having to send it long distance, basically recycle it, which of course would probably increase the cost on a construction site if you have to have multiple containers. But is that the kind of thing that municipalities, with legislation would want to investigate to, maybe change their codes to require that?
So I think the basic answer to that question is any time that we can be recycling more material rather than putting in the landfill is not only saving the planet, but it's also reducing costs. To the extent that there's a market for those materials, which, like any recyclable, is really the constraint. I can pull things out of the waste stream, but I no use doing that if I can't get some value for it, and rather than disposing of it. I know on Long Island there's some very sophisticated processing systems, but I also know, as an example, in the state of Massachusetts, similar to what you spoke about in California, because I worked with Thornhill Partners at facilities in Massachusetts, they have a similar law, and that law seems to be working. So there's more and more materials coming out of C&D. So the answer is, yeah, I think we need to look closer at that, but there still will be, at the end of the day, a huge volume of material that's got to go to a landfill. And I would also say that it's my understanding that over the years, and increasingly in recent years, the actual material going into the Brookhaven landfill is pretty much the remains of processed C&D. So still, we look at that volume that needs to be disposed of by landfill.
Right. That's a good point, because if the C&D is going to a sorting facility first, or just any kind of a transfer station, anything of value is probably going to be taken out, if possible, before that goes on to disposal. We have a question here from our friend Eric. How long will 110 Sand be able to continue once Brookhaven closes? Any idea?
So I think you can actually access the DEC website and see their annual reports. I think that frankly, they regulate how much they take on each day, so they can have space available. but I'm going to say it's easily 25 years.
But not for the full volume of what Brookhaven will be shutting out.
Well, I think that's hard to tell. I mean, one of the issues that we always know is garbage goes where garbage goes cheapest. So what are the pricings going to be at the 110 Sand Company when the Brookhaven landfill closes?
Right. Let me see here. We have okay, trying to see if there's any questions that I may have missed. Actually, well, there is one that another one I had, and I think you addressed this in your in Michael in your presentation, but it's my impression that the biggest volume of exported that commercial MSW makes up by far the largest portion of MSW that is exported from the island. Is that correct? That the most residential waste is filling up the incinerators for the most part, or the waste energy plants, excuse me, and it's commercial that's being shipped off.
Well, as I kind of ran through in some of the information, as you said, Jim, we look at the two towns, Oyster Bay and North Hempstead. All of their MSW is being shipped off presently by truck. So, and we look at commercial waste in the towns of Babylon, was the commercial district that's going to the energy from waste facility. In the town of Smithtown, where there's a form of flow control legislation, that's going to the Huntington Smithtown facility. And in Hempstead also has a flow control code, so they're getting commercial waste in there. But at the end of the day, I said, whether you look at what's being shipped off from Oyster Bay and North Hempstead, as well as the remainder of commercial waste, that's where you're looking at probably at least 150, 160 trucks a day. You can see them on the expressway. When we saw that picture on the front page of Newsday, we looked closely to see if there was a flatbed with bales on it. There wasn't, but frankly, pretty much anytime you drive on the expressway, you'll see one.
Right. Yeah, I don't know if it was this morning or yesterday morning, it was on the traffic report was something to the effect of, I might have been in New Jersey, so I was not on the island, but an accident with multiple tractor trailers clogging, like, Route 4 or something like that. And that, of course, I always think it's got to be garbage trucks. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, back to the rail question and truck versus rail. If we look at New York City, so when the Fresh Kills landfill finally did close, and I think Marty Ballou, who's on the line here, was involved with setting up what the options were. So what you have from New York City waste is going out by rail. Clearly, as Jerry says, for the most part, they could get to the other side of the Hudson a lot easier than we can. But it shows you that option can work.
Mm-hmm. One of the earlier questions that I think I missed, but it's pretty relevant, is what is the volume of ash that is transported off Long Island? I was always under the impression that the majority of it stayed on the island, but that's, is some of it leaving?
So I don't know if there's anybody from Covanta on the line, but my understanding of that is that all the ash from all the energy from waste facilities on Long Island is staying on Long Island. But again, that's going to be a call that Covanta has to make at some point.
Right. All right. Well, we're nearing the hour that was earmarked for this webinar, and let me see if there's anything else that. Here's one. Does MSW need to be moved on unit trains to export from Long Island? And if so, where would the unit trains be constructed? On Long Island, or would they be put together in Fresh Pond or Oak Point or somewhere else?
So depends on what you talk about, a unit train. For the most part, the freight on Long Island, and I think we have somebody from New York and Atlantic on the line here, is not moved by unit trains. So out west, we have unit trains. You probably, can see them on various ads or movies. You'll see trains with 50, 100 rail cars. That's never going to happen on Long Island. A unit train would be much, much smaller, but it would probably be more efficient. But the really big issue with shipping MSW out by rail is the containerization. Okay, so you're really looking at putting it in containers under the present tariff that the New York Atlantic Rail has, and then putting those containers on a rail car. So it's not so much whether you or not you have a unit train, it's that issue with respect to how it's packaged or the containerization.
And that I would point out, Michael, that that's directly related to issues of community concern in New York City about waste moving through the city, how it's containerized, and whether it's contained or not is a big issue that the communities have raised.
And by the way, it's not an insurmountable issue, but it goes to the one of the issues I raised earlier with respect to we're going to see increasing costs. That's going to happen because that material is going to have to move.
Well, it certainly is, like I said in the beginning, it's a vexing issue, and it's just so ironic that, Long Island with this massive concentration of people and waste, and really can't handle it. And that's why I think it is, I don't know if it's proper to say somewhat unique. You're either unique or you're not unique, but I think most populated areas they can go in 4 directions to get out, and we can't. So, and really only if you're talking about trucks, it's basically 2 roads. You're either on the Brooklyn Queens Expressway heading down to the Verrazano, or you're on the Cross Bronx heading to the GW, and that's quite a limitation. So,
and Jim, I wanted to say one more thing, possibly closing here. We have undertaken efforts for planning. I know the group and the many committee members and people that attended our Long Island Solid Waste Leadership Council. We've been a little stalled on that, the Planning Council with COVID. It's hard to kind of form groups and work with that. But I have to I show great respect for Supervisor Romaine in the town of Brookhaven. The supervisor has been saying for months and months and months, this crisis needs to be addressed. And of course, the town's doing the best it can to say, we know the landfill is an issue, whether there's an ash fill or not, that make really good sense. And so, as I think may have been pointed out earlier, I understand there's a scoping session. So again, I think Supervisor Romaine has really paid a lot of attention to this, and I think has been really a spark to make all of us focus on it.
well, that's certainly, it's good to know and provide some hope there. I think with that, we'll wrap up this webinar. The next webinar will be on October the 14th and deal with waste to energy issues and the plans for future burning. In fact, that was a question, but better for that time, about the expansion of the existing waste to energy facilities, what the prospects might be for that. So that should be a very interesting and topical webinar. I want to thank everybody for participating, and for Michael and Jerry for really good presentations here. Really informative. I mean, this whole series has been great, and this is probably maybe the biggest single issue facing the whole waste issue is with transportation, and it's been good having you, gratifying, and a good learning experience. So thank you very much. I don't know, Caitlin, do I throw this back to you, or how do we want to finish that up?
I think we're good to just say thank you all for attending. And the only other thing I would add is that this has been recorded, and it will be available on both the Liblit website as well as the Stony Brook University School of Marine and Atmospheric Sciences YouTube page, probably in the next few days. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, everyone.
Stay safe, everyone.